When the desperate whimper of a dying leopard cub pierced through the silence of the Tanzanian wilderness, nobody at the Serengeti Wildlife Rescue Station could have imagined this moment would mark the beginning of a miracle that would defy nature itself. The tiny spotted creature, weighing barely more than a newborn kitten, was fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. Marcus Rodriguez had seen his share of impossible battles. As a former Marine who served 3 tours in Afghanistan, he understood what it meant to fight against overwhelming odds. But nothing in his military training had prepared him for the fragile life that would soon change everything he thought he knew about survival and determination. At 42 years old, Marcus had traded his combat boots for hiking boots, finding peace in the vast landscapes of East Africa, where he worked as a senior wildlife rehabilitator. The Serengeti Wildlife Rescue Station had become his sanctuary after returning from deployment with invisible wounds that civilian life couldn't heal. Here, among the acacia trees and endless grasslands, he found purpose in saving creatures that couldn't save themselves. His colleagues respected his methodical approach to animal care, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his unwavering dedication to even the most hopeless cases. What they didn't know was that each rescued animal represented something deeper for Marcus, a chance to heal parts of himself that war had broken. The rescue station operated with military-like precision, something Marcus appreciated and had helped establish. Every morning began at dawn with rounds to check on the recovering animals. Every evening ended with detailed reports and preparations for the next day's challenges. It was a routine that brought structure to his post-military life, a rhythm that kept the darker memories at bay. The work was demanding, often heartbreaking, but it was honest work that made a difference in the world. But on this particular evening in September 2023, as the African sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Marcus was about to encounter a challenge that would test every skill he had learned both in war and in wildlife rehabilitation. The radio crackled with an urgent message from the field team, and the words they spoke would set in motion a story of survival that defied all expectations. The field team's Land Rover roared into the station's compound just as the last light was fading from the horizon. Dr. Sarah Kamani, the station's head veterinarian, jumped from the passenger seat with a look of urgency that Marcus had rarely seen in her normally composed demeanor. Behind her, Ranger Joseph Mwangi carefully lifted a small transport crate from the vehicle's cargo area, his weathered hands moving with the gentleness reserved for the most delicate rescues. Marcus approached the group, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. Inside the crate, barely visible through the ventilation holes, lay what appeared to be the smallest leopard cub he had ever encountered. The animal was motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its tiny chest, each breath seeming to require tremendous effort. Its spotted coat was dull and matted, and its eyes remained closed in what looked more like unconsciousness than sleep. The story unfolded quickly as the team gathered in the emergency treatment room. A tourist safari group had discovered the cub alone beside a watering hole, approximately 3 days old and already abandoned. The mother was nowhere to be found, and tracks in the surrounding area told a grim tale of a territorial fight between adult leopards. Fresh scars on nearby trees and scattered fur suggested a violent encounter that had likely claimed the mother's life, leaving her newborn to face the harsh reality of the African wilderness alone. Dr. Kamani's initial examination revealed the devastating extent of the cub's condition. Severe dehydration had left his skin loose and his gums pale. His body temperature was dangerously low, and his weight registered at barely 800 grams, far below what a healthy 3-day-old leopard should weigh. Most concerning of all was his complete lack of response to stimuli. When Dr. Kamani gently touched his paw, there was no reflexive withdrawal. When she shined a light near his closed eyes, there was no reaction. The silence in the room was heavy as the team processed the grim reality. In his 15 years of wildlife rehabilitation, Marcus had learned to read the unspoken language between veterinarians and their patients. The exchanged glances, the careful choice of words, the way hands moved with both professional care and personal resignation. This cub wasn't just sick, he was dying, and everyone in the room knew it. Dr. Kimani worked with methodical precision, establishing an intravenous line thinner than a strand of hair into the cub's tiny front leg. The specialized pediatric equipment, designed for the smallest of patients, looked almost comically large against the leopard's fragile frame. Marcus watched as she administered warmed saline solution drop by drop, each increment carefully calculated to avoid overwhelming the cub's compromised system. The heart monitor displayed a rhythm so faint and irregular that the machine struggled to maintain a consistent reading. The veterinary team had faced similar cases before, and the statistics were brutally clear. Leopard cubs abandoned at such a young age had less than a 5% survival rate, even with intensive medical intervention. Without the antibodies and nutrients from their mother's milk, their immune systems remained virtually non-existent. Their inability to regulate body temperature, combined with their underdeveloped digestive systems, created a cascade of physiological failures that modern medicine could slow but rarely reverse. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As the night progressed, Marcus found himself drawn repeatedly to the incubator where the cub lay surrounded by warming blankets and monitoring equipment. The steady hum of the oxygen concentrator provided a rhythmic backdrop to the occasional beeps from the heart monitor. Each breath the cub took seemed labored, as if he was fighting an invisible enemy that grew stronger with each passing hour. His tiny paws occasionally twitched, the only sign that life still flickered within the still form. Dr. Kamani emerged from her office with a clipboard full of notes and an expression that Marcus recognized from his military days, the look of someone preparing to deliver news that nobody wanted to hear. She had consulted with wildlife veterinarians across 3 continents, reviewed every research paper on leopard cub rehabilitation, and run blood work that confirmed their worst fears. The cub's kidney function was deteriorating rapidly, his blood sugar levels were critically low, and infection markers were climbing despite aggressive antibiotic treatment. The conversation that followed was conducted in the hushed tones reserved for the most serious medical discussions. Treatment options were limited and expensive, with no guarantee of success. The ethical considerations weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Was it fair to prolong suffering in pursuit of an outcome that seemed increasingly impossible? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear and impossible to ignore. The decision point arrived at 3 in the morning when the cub's vital signs took a dramatic turn for the worse. His heart rate had dropped to dangerous levels, and his breathing became so shallow that the monitors could barely detect it. Dr. Kimani called an emergency meeting in the small conference room adjacent to the medical facility, her voice carrying the weight of years spent making impossible choices. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled team as they gathered around the scarred wooden table. Marcus listened as Dr. Kimani outlined the medical realities with clinical precision. The cub's condition had deteriorated beyond what their current treatment protocols could address. His organs were beginning to shut down in sequence, starting with his kidneys and progressing toward complete system failure. The blood work showed dangerously elevated toxin levels that indicated his body was essentially poisoning itself. Without immediate and extraordinary intervention, they had perhaps 6 hours before the situation became irreversible. The room fell silent as she presented 2 stark options. The first was to increase palliative care and allow nature to take its course, ensuring the cub experienced no pain in his final hours. This was the medically sound choice, the one that acknowledged the harsh realities of wildlife rehabilitation and the limits of veterinary science. The second option was experimental and had never been attempted at their facility, round-the-clock intensive care that would require someone to monitor the cub every 15 minutes, manually feeding him specialized formula through a tube while maintaining his body temperature and administering medications on a precise schedule. Joseph Mwangi, the station's most experienced ranger, voiced what everyone was thinking. The resources required for such intensive care would be enormous, pulling staff away from other animals who had better chances of survival. The emotional toll on whoever took on this responsibility would be significant, especially if the cub died despite their efforts. There was also the question of precedent. If they went to such extraordinary lengths for one animal, how could they justify not doing the same for future cases? Marcus found himself thinking about a moment during his second deployment when his unit had been asked to risk everything to save a wounded soldier in an impossible situation. The mission had been classified as non-essential by command, but his sergeant had looked at the map, studied the odds, and made a decision that changed everything. Sometimes, the sergeant had said, You don't save someone because it makes tactical sense. You save them because it's who you choose to be. Marcus cleared his throat and broke the heavy silence that had settled over the conference room. His voice carried the steady tone of someone who had made difficult decisions under pressure before, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he placed them flat on the table. He volunteered to take full responsibility for the intensive care protocol, understanding completely that this meant committing the next several weeks of his life to a routine that would make his military deployments seem manageable by comparison. Dr. Kimani studied Marcus carefully, recognizing something in his expression that went beyond professional dedication. She had worked with him for 3 years and had never seen him request such personal involvement in a case. Her concerns were practical and immediate. The round-the-clock care would require Marcus to essentially live at the facility, sleeping in 15-minute intervals and maintaining precise medical protocols without any margin for error. One missed feeding or medication could undo days of progress and potentially kill the cub within hours. The logistics were staggering. Marcus would need to prepare specialized formula every 2 hours, using a complex mixture of leopard milk substitute, electrolytes, and immune-boosting supplements. The feeding process alone required 45 minutes of careful tube insertion, slow administration to prevent aspiration, and post-feeding monitoring to ensure proper digestion. Between feedings, he would need to stimulate the cub's elimination reflexes, adjust heating elements, record vital signs, and administer medications through the IV line that would need to be replaced every 3 days. Dr. Kimani walked Marcus through the medical protocols with the thoroughness of a military briefing. The feeding tube had to be measured precisely before each insertion to ensure it reached the stomach without entering the lungs. The formula temperature needed to be maintained at exactly 38 degrees Celsius. Too cool and the cub's metabolism would slow further, too warm and it could cause internal burns. The IV medications required calculations based on the cub's fluctuating weight, measured twice daily on a scale sensitive enough to detect changes of 5 grams. As dawn approached, Marcus moved his few personal belongings into the small staff quarters adjacent to the medical wing. His new world would consist of a 10-foot radius around the incubator, a coffee machine that would become his lifeline, and a determination that surprised even him with its intensity. The cub remained motionless in his warming chamber, unaware that his survival now depended on the unwavering commitment of a man who understood what it meant to fight impossible battles. The first 72 hours tested every ounce of Marcus's military discipline and mental endurance. His world condensed into a precise choreography of medical procedures performed in near darkness to avoid overstimulating the fragile patient. Every 2 hours, his phone alarm would pierce the silence, and Marcus would rise from whatever brief rest he had managed to steal. His movements became automatic: check temperature, prepare formula, inspect the IV line, measure the exact length of feeding tube insertion, and begin the delicate process of nourishing a creature whose digestive system barely functioned. The cub remained unconscious for the first week, his body so focused on basic survival that higher brain functions seemed to have shut down completely. Marcus learned to read the subtle signs that indicated improvement or decline. The slight change in breathing rhythm that meant the lungs were clearing, the barely perceptible shift in skin color that suggested better circulation, the microscopic weight gains measured in grams that represented monumental victories. Each successful feeding felt like a small miracle, each stable night like winning a battle in a war that had no clear end. Marcus named him Ranger, partly in honor of Joseph Mwangi who had found him, but mostly because the name suggested resilience and survival in harsh conditions. Speaking to Ranger became part of the routine, Marcus's voice providing a constant, calm presence in the sterile medical environment. He described the weather outside, the activities of other animals at the facility, and memories from his childhood growing up on his grandfather's ranch in New Mexico. The one-sided conversations helped Marcus stay alert during the long nights and created a bond he hadn't expected. By the 10th day, subtle changes began to emerge. Ranger's ears occasionally twitched when Marcus spoke, suggesting that hearing was returning as brain function improved. His reflexes showed marginal improvement when Dr. Kimani performed her daily neurological assessments. Most importantly, his body temperature began stabilizing at normal levels, reducing the reliance on external heating sources. The weight gain remained minimal but steady, 50 grams over 10 days represented a victory that the medical team celebrated with quiet relief. The breakthrough came on day 14 when Marcus arrived for the midnight feeding to find Ranger's eyes partially open for the first time. The pale blue gaze was unfocused and cloudy, but unmistakably aware. When Marcus spoke softly, the tiny head turned slightly toward the sound, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met in recognition. As Ranger's strength gradually returned over the following weeks, new challenges emerged that Marcus hadn't anticipated. The cub's natural instincts began awakening alongside his physical recovery, creating complications that textbooks on wildlife rehabilitation had never adequately addressed. At 6 weeks old, Ranger displayed an unusual attachment to Marcus that went far beyond normal imprinting behavior seen in rescued animals. He would become agitated and refuse to eat when other staff members attempted to handle his care, his heart rate spiking dangerously on the monitors whenever Marcus left the room for more than 30 minutes. Dr. Kimani expressed growing concern about the intensity of this bond during their weekly progress meetings. While Ranger's physical recovery had exceeded all expectations, he now weighed nearly 2 kilograms and could maintain his own body temperature. His behavioral development was following an unprecedented pattern. Unlike other hand-raised leopards who gradually showed interest in their natural environment, Ranger seemed completely fixated on human interaction. He would cry incessantly when placed in the outdoor rehabilitation enclosure, only settling when Marcus sat nearby. His play behavior mimicked that of a domestic kitten rather than a wild predator, lacking the stalking and pouncing instincts that should have emerged naturally. The situation became more complex as Ranger grew stronger and more mobile. His razor-sharp claws, initially too weak to cause any damage, now required careful handling as he instinctively climbed onto Marcus during feeding times. His teeth, once barely visible bumps on his gums, had developed into needle-sharp points that he used with increasing frequency during what he seemed to consider playful interactions. Marcus found himself covered in small scratches and puncture wounds that he dismissed as occupational hazards, but Dr. Kimani worried about the implications of a growing leopard who had no concept of his own strength or the vulnerability of humans. The most troubling development was Ranger's complete lack of fear response to other leopards. When Dr. Kimani attempted to introduce him to Luna, a gentle female leopard who had successfully mentored other orphan cubs, Ranger showed no recognition of his own species. Instead, he cowered behind Marcus, trembling and vocalizing in distress. Luna's natural leopard behaviors, the way she moved, her scent, her communication patterns, seemed to terrify Ranger in a way that suggested fundamental confusion about his own identity. The implications of this behavioral anomaly raised difficult questions about Ranger's future and his ability to ever live as a wild leopard. The crisis reached its peak when Ranger turned 4 months old and weighed nearly 15 kilograms of pure muscle and growing confidence. What had once been gentle play behaviors had evolved into powerful displays of strength that left Marcus with deep scratches and bruises he could no longer hide from his colleagues. During one particularly intense play session, Ranger's enthusiasm resulted in a gash across Marcus's forearm that required 12 stitches and raised serious questions about safety protocols. Dr. Kimani called an emergency meeting with the facility's board of directors, presenting medical documentation of the escalating incidents. The board's discussion was frank and uncomfortable. Ranger had become too large and strong to be handled safely by one person, yet his psychological dependence on Marcus had only intensified with time. He refused to eat when Marcus was away for more than a few hours, leading to dangerous weight loss that threatened his health. More concerning was his complete inability to interact with other leopards, or show any interest in natural behaviors essential for survival. Multiple attempts to house him with other big cats had resulted in panic attacks so severe that veterinary intervention was required. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus faced the most difficult decision of his post-military life as 3 options were presented with devastating clarity. The first was immediate placement in a specialized zoo facility equipped to handle behaviorally compromised big cats, where Ranger would live in permanent captivity but receive professional care. The second option involved continued attempts at rehabilitation with professional animal behaviorists, though experts warned the likelihood of success was minimal given the depth of Ranger's psychological conditioning. The third option, spoken in hushed tones, acknowledged that some rescue cases couldn't be resolved and required humane intervention to prevent prolonged suffering. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Marcus with familiar intensity, reminiscent of command decisions he had made in Afghanistan when every choice carried life-or-death consequences. He thought about the promise he had whispered to an unconscious cub months earlier, about being there no matter what that meant. He considered Ranger's quality of life, trapped between two worlds with no clear path forward. The irony wasn't lost on him that saving Ranger's life had created a different kind of prison, one built from love and good intentions but confining nonetheless. That night, as he watched Ranger sleep peacefully in his specially designed enclosure, Marcus began formulating a plan that would require sacrificing everything he had built for himself in Tanzania. Sometimes the most loving decision wasn't the one that felt good. It was the one that gave the other person, or in this case, the other creature, the best possible future. Marcus spent 3 sleepless weeks researching and planning what he privately called Operation New Beginning. His military background had taught him that the most effective solutions often required thinking beyond conventional parameters, and Ranger's situation demanded exactly that kind of creative problem-solving. He contacted wildlife sanctuaries across 4 continents, veterinary behaviorists who specialized in human-imprinted predators, and even reached out to his former commanding officer who had connections in the private security world where exotic animal handling was sometimes required. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source: Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned animal psychologist who operated a unique rehabilitation facility in the mountains of Costa Rica. Her sanctuary specialized in cases like Ranger's, providing a bridge environment where human-imprinted animals could live with dignity, while gradually developing more natural behaviors. What made her approach revolutionary was the concept of graduated independence, allowing animals to maintain their human bonds while slowly expanding their comfort zones with their own species. The logistics of relocating Ranger to Costa Rica were staggering. International permits for transporting endangered species required months of paperwork and coordination between government agencies in 3 countries. The specialized transport crate needed to be custom-built to accommodate Ranger's size while ensuring his psychological comfort during the 36-hour journey. Most challenging of all was the financial reality. The total cost of transport, permits, and long-term care at Dr. Vasquez's facility exceeded Marcus's annual salary by a significant margin. Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He liquidated his retirement savings, sold his truck and motorcycle, and took out a personal loan against his future earnings. When Dr. Kimani learned about his financial sacrifice, she was initially angry, arguing that Marcus was destroying his own future for an animal that might never adapt successfully. Their conversation in her office grew heated as she pointed out the practical impossibilities of his plan and the likelihood that he would end up bankrupt with nothing to show for his efforts. But Marcus had found a clarity that reminded him of his best moments in the military, when the mission became more important than personal comfort or conventional wisdom. He explained to Dr. Kimani that Ranger had taught him something fundamental about commitment and responsibility. The leopard had fought impossible odds to survive, and now it was Marcus's turn to fight impossible odds to give Ranger a chance at something approaching a normal life. The farewell at Kilimanjaro International Airport was more emotional than Marcus had anticipated. Ranger, now weighing 32 kilograms of sleek muscle, remained calm in his custom transport crate, as long as Marcus's hand stayed pressed against the mesh where he could feel the familiar touch. Dr. Kimani stood beside them, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the end of an extraordinary chapter in wildlife rehabilitation history. 6 months later, Marcus received a video call that changed everything. Dr. Vasquez's face filled his laptop screen, beaming with excitement as she turned the camera toward a remarkable scene. Ranger was playing with 2 other human-imprinted leopards in a sprawling natural enclosure, his movements confident and graceful. More incredibly, he had learned to hunt, to climb with purpose, and to communicate with his own kind using the complex vocalizations that had seemed lost forever. Marcus watched through tears as Ranger demonstrated behaviors he never thought possible, stalking prey, marking territory, and engaging in the social dynamics that defined wild leopards. The most powerful moment came when Ranger looked directly into the camera and made a sound Marcus had never heard before, a deep, contented chuff that spoke of peace and belonging. Today, Ranger serves as an ambassador for his species, helping other traumatized leopards learn to trust again while educating visitors about conservation. Marcus visits twice a year, and each reunion proves that love doesn't diminish with distance. It transforms into something even more powerful. Ranger's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, and that miracles happen when we refuse to accept impossible odds. His journey from a dying cub to a thriving ambassador proves that with determination, sacrifice, and unwavering faith, even the most broken spirits can find their way home. If Ranger's incredible transformation inspired you, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing rescue stories that prove hope never dies. Hit that notification bell to join our community of wildlife warriors making a difference one life at a time.